Hello, my name is Linda Mordosky with Customer Advanced Engineering, and in this module we're going to talk about configuring Cisco Media Blender for blended collaboration and callback. During this session we'll complete our post-install task and we'll also configure the Cisco Media Blender property files. Once you have installed Cisco Media Blender, you will want to change II6 to run in worker process isolation mode. To change this, bring up Internet Information Services Manager and navigate to Websites. Right-click on Websites and select Properties. From Website Properties, select the Service menu and then uncheck the Isolation mode. Then select Apply. The IIS Manager will come back and state that some properties changed will require a restart. Do you want to restart IIS now? Select No here and then we'll go into Services and manually restart IIS. Otherwise, when you come back in to IIS, your change will have not been saved. Then select OK to save your changes. Now from the Windows Services panel, go ahead and restart IIS. Here are some network considerations when installing Cisco Media Blender. You will need to maintain host files on the servers running Cisco Media Blender and CIM Services server. Using DNS can result in RMI connectivity problems. Cisco Media Blender host file must have an entry for the CIM Services server. Likewise, the CIM Services server must have an entry for Cisco Media Blender. Also, the round-trip delay between the Cisco Media Blender and the CIM Services server should be no more than 1,000 milliseconds. Cisco Media Blender property files. Just a few notes on the property files. First of all, only define a property once in a file. Media Blender will only recognize the last occurrence of the property. When you enter the properties in the property file, they should be entered all in uppercase or all in lowercase letters. Also ensure that the Blender.properties, ACDciscocti.properties, and the Collaboration.properties files are in the same directory. They should be in the Cisco MB Servlet Properties Blender directory. And also, anytime you make changes to the properties, you will need to restart the Media Blender. The CMB Properties files are located on the Media Blender in Cisco MB Servlet Properties Blender directory, where Cisco CMB is a location defined during the installation of the Media Blender. We will now discuss the Blender property files, the ACDciscocti property file, and the Collaboration property file. Let's take a more visual look at how these property files work. The Blender properties file is the main properties file for the Cisco Media Blender. This property file identifies the Medium 1 and Medium 2. Medium 1, or the ACD medium, will connect to the CTI server. The ACDciscocti properties file will provide the connection properties to the CTI server and identify the CTI strategy, meaning is a connection to IPCC or to an Avaya. The remote medium will connect to the CIM Services server. The Collaboration properties file will identify the connection properties to the CIM Services server. The CIM server will get its connection properties from the properties file on the file server with the name IP_port.properties file. We'll discuss this file in a later slide. Now to configure the Blender.properties file. Medium 1 identifies the type of ACD this installation of CMB will be integrated with. To identify this medium, uncomment the correct medium 1 for the ACD. All IPCC configurations uncomment media 1 equal ACDciscocti.properties. If this deployment is integrated to an Avaya, then uncomment media 1 equal ACD.asai.properties. Medium 2 should be uncommented by default. This is a queuing media, in this case the Cisco Collaboration server. By default, the log level is set to 5. To configure the ACDciscocti.properties, we first need to identify the CTI strategy by uncommenting the correct strategy. For IPCC, the correct strategy is agent reserved. Additional information on properties that are relevant to the dial plan can be found in the Cisco Media Blender documentation. To define the type of peripheral, uncomment peripheral.type equal IPCC. Next, enter the peripheral ID. In our example, our peripheral ID is 5000. We will then enter the host name of the CTI server. Remember, you will need to create a host file on the Cisco CMB server. The host port of the CTI server, this default value is 42027. If your deployment is redundant, then enter the host name and port of the secondary PG. Next, we'll fill in a username. This is an optional field, but can be very useful in troubleshooting connections to the CTI server. Optional password, peripheral password. This value can be blank if authentication is disabled on the CTI server. The ECC variables user.cisco.cmb and user.cisco.cmb call class need to be configured in the ICM configuration manager to use callback. If you want to allow an agent the ability to continue talking to a customer after the collaboration session has dropped, then you need to uncomment the property except drop equal false. This property determines whether to accept the request to drop the voice call. The default value is except drop equal true. A value of true disconnects the agent and caller when the collaboration session drops. The RMI Registry Port for CIM was defined during the CIM installation. The default value is 15099. This value is configured in the Collaboration.properties file. To configure the Collaboration.properties file, we'll first enter the host name or IP address of the CIM Services server. Next, enter the remote registry port as was defined during the CIM install. Again, the default value is 15099. Enter the remote password, which will be the CIM password. After the Media Blender has started, the password will then be encrypted in this file. The local port for CMB, the default value here is 1099, and then next configure the local password for CMB. After you have defined the values in the property files, then the entire Cisco CMB directory needs to be copied to the services server. The Cisco CMB directory on the services server needs to be placed in the same directory as it is on the Cisco Media Blender. In this case, we will place it in the directory C/Cisco CMB. Once the entire Cisco Media Blender directory has been copied to the services server, navigate to the file server and rename the CMB properties file. This file is located again on the file server in the CIM eService config CMB directory. Rename this file to the IP address of the Cisco Media Blender server _ local server port configured on the Media Blender.properties. Again, the default port for CMB is 1099. Once you have renamed the file, you will need to modify the passwords on this CIM Properties file. The remote CMB password will be the local CIM password, and the local CIM password will then be the remote CMB password. Here on the left we have the CIM property file prior to modifying the passwords, and on the right we have the property file after the passwords have been modified. Also note, you will need to configure the IP address and the registry port of the Cisco Media Blender server in this properties file. And again, the default port for Cisco Media Blender is 1099. In this module, we configured Cisco Media Blender to run in IIS 6.0 worker process isolation mode. We discussed the network considerations. We also configured the Cisco Media Blender property files, as well as configured the Cisco Interaction Manager property files.